The small town lay under the shadow of silence. The houses stood close together, their walls cracked with age, their windows often shut tight even during the day. People moved through the narrow streets quietly, as if every sound might bring unwanted attention. Conversations never rose above a whisper, and laughter, once a natural part of life, had disappeared almost completely. Children played only in short bursts, but even their games were subdued. They had been taught not to draw too much notice. The air itself felt heavy, filled with the weight of things left unsaid. For years, this community had learned to live with fear. It did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching over the land. First came the rules, then the punishments, and eventually the silence. People understood that speaking too freely could invite trouble. A wrong word might bring a visit from the authorities, and that visit usually meant loss. Loss of property, loss of safety, sometimes even loss of a family member who might never return the same way again. So the people chose quietness. They told themselves it was safer this way. Every morning, men and women went to work without complaint. They repaired buildings, tended small shops, or worked long hours in the fields. Yet behind their eyes lay a dull weariness. They did what was needed to survive, but inside they carried a constant tremor, a fear that never truly faded. Even the act of greeting a neighbor became careful, a quick nod rather than a cheerful word. Trust was fragile. Anyone might be listening. Anyone might report them for something they had not even realized they had said. At night, families gathered, in dimly lit rooms. Candles flickered as mothers hushed their children, telling them bedtime stories in low voices. But even the stories had changed. Tales of courage or rebellion were avoided. Instead, the stories were about patience, about waiting, about keeping safe. Children grew up thinking silence was a form of survival, not a burden. Parents believed they were protecting their sons and daughters, but in truth, they were passing on the same quiet fear they had inherited themselves. There were moments when the people wanted to rise, when anger burned in their chests. A father might clench his fists after being humiliated by a guard. A mother might cry silently after seeing her family pushed aside unfairly. Friends sometimes gathered in secret, whispering about what life could be if they did not live under such a shadow. But the whispers always ended the same way, with a sigh, with a shake of the head, with the thought that they were too small, too weak, too powerless to change anything. And so they remained still, trembling in silence. It wasn't that the people were cowards. They had endured many hardships before. They had weathered storms, rebuilt their homes after disasters, and cared for one another in times of need. Strength lived in them, but it had been buried under layers of fear. The fear told them that resistance was impossible. The fear whispered that silence was the only way to survive. And when fear becomes a habit, it is harder to break than chains of iron. Some of the older townsfolk remembered better times. They remembered when the marketplace had been alive with voices, when musicians played freely in the square, when children ran through the streets without worry. They would sometimes sit by their doors and think of those days, their eyes distant. But when younger people asked about those memories, the elders would quickly grow quiet, shaking their heads as if afraid that even remembering the past too openly might be dangerous. Hope, too, had become something to hide. The silence was not just in their voices. It was in their actions. A farmer who was cheated out of his harvest would swallow his anger and accept the loss. A shopkeeper whose goods were taken unfairly would bow his head and continue selling with a forced smile. Workers who were forced to labor longer hours would simply endure, too afraid to ask for rest. Every injustice was absorbed in silence, adding another layer to the invisible walls that surrounded the community. Day after day, people trembled, not always outwardly, but inside, where the weight of helplessness pressed hardest. Yet even within the silence, there were flickers of something unspoken. A neighbor quietly leaving food at another's door when times grew too hard. A teacher secretly telling her students that they should dream of a brighter future. A child asking why they had to stay so quiet, and a parent hesitating before giving the usual answer. These small acts did not break the silence. but they hinted at something beneath it, something waiting for the right moment to rise. It was as though the community was holding its breath, unsure when, or if, it would ever be safe to exhale. The silence, though suffocating, created a strange unity among the people. They all knew the rules. They all felt the same fear. And though they rarely spoke of it, each person carried the quiet hope that someday, someone would take the first step toward change. But no one dared to believe it could truly happen. They told themselves change was for others, not for them. They were too used to trembling, too used to surviving one quiet day after another. In the distance, rumors spread of outsiders, people known for their resilience, for surviving in harsh lands, where others would not last a single day. They were called Deathworlders, spoken of in hushed tones as though even their name carried weight. Some said these people were fearless. Others claimed they were simply too stubborn to break. For most of the community, these were only stories, passed along like folk tales. No one really expected such people to come near their small, silent town. And so life continued, unchanged, heavy with unspoken words and unseen tears. The silence became their cage, but also their shield. As long as they stayed quiet, as long as they kept their heads down, they could continue existing. That was what they told themselves. Yet deep within, a question remained, unspoken but alive. How long could they go on this way? Could silence truly protect them forever, or was it slowly destroying them from within? The answer had not yet come. For now, they only trembled in silence, waiting for something, anything that might stir them awake. The silence of the small town hid many wounds, but the scars were visible if one looked closely. Every family had a story of loss. Some had been forced to give up their land. Others had watched their possessions taken away without reason. A few had lost fathers, brothers, or sons who never returned after being taken for questioning. People did not speak of these things openly, yet everyone carried the knowledge of them. It was like living in a house where every wall was cracked. Some cracks small, some wide, but all of them reminders that safety was fragile. The oppressors who controlled the town rarely showed mercy. They came in groups, walking with loud boots, their presence enough to make mothers pull their children inside and men step aside silently. They did not need to shout to show their power. Their actions spoke for them. A family who refused an order would find their home searched and broken. A farmer who argued over his harvest might lose his entire crop. A shopkeeper who asked too many questions would find his shelves empty the next day, his goods taken away in the name of authority. These acts were not random. They were warnings, carefully chosen to remind everyone of what silence was worth. Children grew up watching this. They saw their fathers clench their jaws instead of speaking out. They saw their mothers bow their heads instead of arguing. They learned early that courage had a price and the price was too high. Even the games they played were shaped by fear. They no longer pretended to be heroes or kings. Instead, they pretended to hide, to escape, to stay unnoticed. Their childhood was shaped not by dreams of greatness, but by practice in survival. The emotional weight pressed hardest on the elders. They remembered the days when freedom had existed, when the streets were alive with color, when families could laugh openly without looking over their shoulders. Now they sat by their doors, their faces lined with worry, watching the world shrink into a smaller and smaller cage. They wanted to tell the young ones about strength, about pride, about hope, but the words stayed trapped in their throats. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, they whispered to each other about the old times. But even then, the whispers were faint, as though fear had followed them even into their memories. The silence was not only about words, it was about actions too. A boy once tried to defend his mother when she was treated unfairly in the market. His brave voice carried for only a moment before a hand struck him down. That night, the boy's father told him never to raise his voice again, no matter what happened. The father's eyes had tears, but his voice was firm. He did not want his son to suffer for a moment of boldness. And so even bravery was taught to bend under the weight of fear. The people told themselves that silence was the smart choice. We must survive, they would say. If we stay quiet, if we obey, maybe tomorrow will be better. But tomorrow always looked like yesterday, and yesterday always looked like the day before. The cycle never broke. Hope dimmed a little, more each season, like a candle burning down to its last light. Yet even in such darkness, stories found their way into the town. Quiet rumors drifted like the wind, carried by travelers or whispered by those who dared to dream. These were stories of outsiders, people who had grown up in places far harsher than their small town. They were known as the Deathworlders. The name alone carried mystery. Some said they came from lands where storms raged for months and wild beasts roamed freely. Others claimed they lived where the ground itself could not be trusted, where survival required unshakable courage. The people of the town listened to these rumors with mixed feelings. Some dismissed them as fantasies, the kind of tales people invent to comfort themselves. Others clung to them quietly, letting the idea of the Deathworlders warm their hearts in the cold silence. The stories said these outsiders could not be broken. They endured suffering without surrender. They stood tall even when everything around them fell. Most importantly, they never bowed their heads in fear. For the townsfolk, it was difficult to imagine such courage. They tried to picture someone standing firm in the marketplace, refusing to step aside. They tried to imagine someone speaking loudly against unfairness without trembling. But these images felt too distant, too impossible. And yet, the thought of such people existing stirred something deep inside them. It was not hope, not yet. But it was a seed. Something planted in their minds that might one day grow. Life in the town continued with its rhythm of quiet suffering. Families woke before dawn, worked through the day, and returned home in silence. Neighbors exchanged careful nods but rarely words. Festivals no longer filled the streets. Music no longer rose into the air. But inside hearts a quiet yearning remained. People wanted more than survival. They wanted dignity. They wanted to breathe without fear. They wanted to hear the sound of their own voices again. Every injustice cut deeper into their spirits. When a young man was taken away without reason, the whole community felt the wound. When a family lost their home, neighbors grieved in silence, unable to protest. Each act of oppression was like a stone placed on their backs, and the weight grew heavier with each passing year. The silence that was meant to protect them had also become a prison. They trembled not only from fear of punishment, but from the knowledge that they had forgotten how to stand tall. Still, the rumors of the Deathworlders lingered. Around fires late at night, when families dared to speak softly, children asked about them. Were they real? Would they ever come? Could anyone be truly unafraid? Parents had no answers, but some found themselves smiling faintly at the thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was truth in the stories. Maybe somewhere in the wide world, people existed who would not tremble, who would not bow their heads. The townsfolk could not know that change was closer than they thought. For now, they lived in the shadows, weighed down by silence, afraid to breathe too loudly. But the stage was being set for something greater. The people did not know it yet, but soon the silence that had ruled their lives would be broken, and it would all begin with a single step forward. The town had lived in silence for so long that the arrival of strangers felt like the beginning of a storm. They came one morning, walking down the dusty road that led into the marketplace. At first, people thought it was only another group of officials, and so the townsfolk lowered their eyes and stepped aside. But when they looked more closely, they realized these people were not the same as the ones they feared. They carried themselves differently. Their clothes were worn from travel, their faces marked by the sun and wind, but their eyes held a calm strength that was unlike anything the town had seen in years. No one knew exactly who they were at first. Some whispered that they must be traitors. Others guessed they were wanderers passing through. But then someone remembered the old stories. Deathworlders, a woman whispered under her breath, though she dared not say it loudly. The word spread quickly from mouth to mouth, until nearly everyone in the marketplace had heard it. Eyes followed the strangers, hope and doubt mingling in the same glance. The Deathworlders did not rush. They did not shout. They moved through the square slowly, looking around as though they were measuring the air itself. Their presence was unsettling not because they were loud or threatening, but because they did not bend their heads like everyone else. They walked upright, their eyes steady, as though fear had no place in them. For the townsfolk, this was something almost impossible to believe. The oppressors noticed the strangers too. A group of guards stepped forward, their boots striking hard against the stone as they came closer. The usual reaction from the townsfolk would have been to scatter, to step aside, to make themselves small. But the Deathworlders did not move. They simply stopped where they were, standing in the middle of the square. The guards expected obedience, but what they found instead was stillness. Calm, unshaken stillness. The silence in the square deepened. Even the merchants who usually called out their prices grew quiet. Children clung to their parents' arms. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the moment when the strangers would lower their eyes, apologize, or step back like everyone else. That was the way things always went. No one resisted. No one stood in the way. But what happened next was unlike anything the townsfolk had ever seen. When the guards ordered the Deathworlders to move aside, one of them, a tall figure with a steady gaze, took a single step forward, just one step. It was not a violent move, not a challenge shouted with anger. It was a simple action, yet it carried the weight of something enormous. The guards froze, surprised. The townsfolk gasped softly. That single step forward seemed to echo louder than any words ever could. The step was small in distance, but great in meaning. It told everyone watching that fear was not the only way to live. It showed that silence did not have to rule forever. The Deathworlder did not raise a hand, did not threaten, did not fight. They simply moved closer instead of moving away. And in that moment, the power in the square shifted. The guards, so used to obedience, suddenly found themselves uncertain. The people, so used to trembling, felt a spark deep inside. The townsfolk had seen many acts of cruelty, but they had never seen anyone stand without fear. The simple act of stepping forward felt like the breaking of chains. Some of the younger men in the crowd felt their own hearts racing faster. Some of the women tightened their grip on their children's hands, not in fear this time, but in something close to awe. The elders blinked slowly, remembering times long ago when courage was not a memory but a way of life. The guards barked orders again, but the Deathworlders did not move back. They remained steady, their faces calm. They did not shout, but their silence was stronger than any cry. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of strength. For the first time, the townsfolk realized that silence could mean something else. It could mean refusal. It could mean resistance. It could mean courage. The tension stretched through the air like a string pulled tight. No one knew what would happen next. Would the guards strike? Would the Deathworlders fight back? But the strangers did not look worried. They stood tall, their presence like a mountain, immovable, patient, unshaken. That patience was more powerful than any weapon. The guards eventually stepped back, muttering among themselves. They had expected obedience, not defiance. They had expected trembling, not calm strength. Their hesitation was brief, but the people saw it. For the first time, the oppressors looked uncertain. That single step had unsettled them more than shouting ever could. The marketplace slowly began to breathe again. People exchanged glances, their eyes wide. No words were spoken, but the thought was the same in every mind. It is possible. Someone can stand against them. The Deathworlders had not overthrown the guards, had not broken the rules, had not even raised their voices. And yet, they had changed everything. That night, the town was alive with whispers. Families gathered in their homes, replaying what they had seen. Fathers told their children about the step forward, their voices trembling not with fear but with something new. Mothers spoke of the calmness in the stranger's eyes. Even the elders admitted they had not seen such courage in many years. The rumor spread quickly. The Deathworlders had come and they were not afraid. The people did not yet know what this meant for their future. They did not know if the strangers would stay, or if they would leave as quietly as they had arrived. But one thing had already changed forever. The people had witnessed what courage looked like. It was not loud, it was not reckless, it was not angry. It was steady. It was simple. It was one step forward when everyone else stepped back in the row. Days that followed, the people found themselves thinking differently. A farmer who had once lowered his head now straightened his back a little when he walked. A shopkeeper who had once smiled weakly at unfair treatment now held his gaze longer before answering. A child who had been taught to whisper asked his parents why the Deathworlders did not fear, and the parents had no answer. Something had shifted in the air. The silence of the town was no longer the same. It was still there, heavy and careful, but now it carried a question inside it. If the strangers could stand firm, why couldn't they? If one step forward could shake the guards, what might happen if the people together took their own step? The townsfolk did not yet know it, but their hearts had already begun to change. The tremble in their voices was weaker now. The weight of fear, though still heavy, was no longer absolute. The first step had been taken, not by them, but for them. And soon, they would have to decide if they too were ready to move forward. The marketplace incident became the talk of the town. For years, people had whispered only about fear, punishment, and loss. But now, for the first time, their whispers carried something else: curiosity, excitement, even hope. Nobody had expected the Deathworlders to do much, yet that single step forward had unsettled the oppressors and lit a spark inside the people. That night, many struggled to sleep. In one home, a father replayed the moment in his mind. He had seen the way the Deathworlders' eyes did not flinch, how their posture never bent. It was only one step, he murmured to his wife. But it felt like a mountain moved. His children listened quietly, their imaginations alive with the thought that maybe courage did not belong only to stories from the past. The next day, life continued as usual. People still woke early to work in the fields, shops still opened, guards still walked through the streets. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The people no longer looked at the guards in quite the same way. They noticed the hesitation, the slight unease that had appeared after the Deathworlders' step. It was small, but it was there, and for the first time, they saw the oppressors as uncertain, not invincible. A farmer at the edge of town was the first to act differently. When a guard came to take more of his harvest than agreed, the farmer's hands shook, but he spoke. "That is too much," he said softly. His voice trembled, but it carried. The guard stared at him, shocked. In the years past, no one ever spoke against them. The guard slapped the basket from the farmer's hands, but the farmer did not bow his head. He simply picked it up again and repeated, "That is too much." It was not a victory, but it was not silence either. And when his neighbors heard of it, they nodded with quiet approval. The ripple had begun. In the schoolhouse, a teacher who usually avoided trouble did something small but daring. Instead of the usual lessons about patience and obedience, she told her students a story about bravery. She spoke of people who had once lived in the town long ago, people who laughed freely and defended one another. The children listened with wide eyes, imagining a world different from the one they knew. She did not say the word courage directly, but every child could feel it in her voice. The Deathworlders had given her the reminder she needed. Silence was not the only way to survive. In the marketplace, merchants began to hold their ground just a little longer. When a guard tried to take goods without paying, one shopkeeper dared to say, "No, you must pay like everyone else." His words were quiet, almost hidden under the noise of the crowd, but those nearby heard them. The guard glared but did not strike. Instead, he moved on, muttering under his breath. People noticed, and their hearts raced, not with fear this time, but with a fragile kind of pride. Even children began to change. Instead of only playing games of hiding in silence, they started pretending to be the Deathworlders. They would stand tall, take one bold step forward, and laugh. Their parents watched with both worry and wonder. The games might seem harmless, but they carried a deeper meaning. The children were no longer practicing fear. They were practicing courage. The Deathworlders themselves did not make grand speeches or lead protests. They simply stayed in the town, living among the people, their presence a quiet reminder of strength. They worked beside the farmers, helped repair broken walls, and shared food with families. Their calmness spread like warmth in winter. The townsfolk realized that courage did not always need to roar. Sometimes it was steady, patient, and unshakable, but change did not come without tension. The guards noticed the small shifts, the longer stares, the firmer voices, the hesitation to obey. They grew harsher in their patrols, trying to crush the new spirit they sensed rising. Yet strangely, their harshness no longer inspired the same level of fear. When they shouted, people did not tremble as much as before. When they struck, the crowd did not scatter quite so quickly. The balance of power was tilting, though slowly, like the first crack spreading across a wall. One evening, a young man named Darren stood in the square. He had seen his father humiliated too many times, his family forced to surrender too much. With the memory of the Deathworlders' step burning in his heart, he refused to move when a guard pushed him aside. His legs shook, his palms sweated, but he stayed where he was. The guard raised a hand to strike him, but then noticed the crowd, watching. Their eyes were no longer empty. They were sharp, alert, waiting. The guard hesitated, then spat on the ground and walked away. The square erupted in hushed murmurs, not of fear, but of excitement. A young man had stood his ground, and the world had not ended. Acts of defiance spread quietly. They were not loud revolts, not yet, but small resistances that grew in number. A baker refused to give away bread without fair exchange. A mother spoke firmly when an official tried to take her child's toy. An old man, tired of years of silence, shouted in anger at a patrol, and though he was dragged away, his voice carried through the streets like a bell ringing. Each act planted seeds in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The Deathworlders never told the people what to do. They did not claim to be leaders, but their example had shown the townsfolk that change was possible. They reminded them of something they had almost forgotten, that fear only had power if it was obeyed. Courage, even in the smallest dose, could begin to weaken it. The elders, who had once sat quietly by their doors, began to speak more openly. They told stories of the old times, not just in whispers, but in steady voices that others could hear. "We were not always silent," one old woman said to a group of children. "We once sang songs in these streets. We once stood together when trouble came. We can do it again." Her words, simple yet strong, carried more weight than she realized. The ripple of courage spread like water across dry land. It did not change everything overnight, but it was steady, unstoppable. The people began to feel their own strength returning. And though they still feared the oppressors, they no longer saw themselves as helpless. They began to believe that silence did not define them anymore. The guards, sensing this shift, grew more uneasy. They could control silence, but courage was harder to contain. Every time someone took a small step forward, it weakened the power of fear. And the Deathworlders, calm, steady, ever-present, reminded the people that once the first step is taken, others will surely follow. The town was no longer trembling the way it once had. The silence had cracked. Courage was moving through the people like a quiet fire, and it was only a matter of time before that fire would burn bright enough to light the whole town. The town had been quiet for so long that the sound of its own heartbeat seemed foreign. But now, after weeks of witnessing courage in small acts, the people were beginning to feel something they had not felt in years: possibility. Every day, more individuals dared to speak, to stand, to act. The change was subtle at first, almost invisible, but slowly it grew stronger until it could no longer be ignored. It began with simple gestures. A mother refused to hide her face when a guard passed by. She held her child close and walked with her head high, no longer shrinking under the weight of fear. A young boy, inspired by the stories the teacher had told, spoke out in the marketplace when another child was treated unfairly. His voice was soft, but it carried clearly, and the surrounding adults noticed. One by one, small acts of defiance spread like waves, quiet yet unyielding. The Deathworlders remained in the background, observing but not interfering. They understood the power of example. Courage, they knew, had to come from within. They had shown the townsfolk that fear could be faced, but it was the people themselves who now had to choose to stand, and slowly they did. In the fields, farmers no longer lowered their heads when officials demanded more than what was fair. They spoke politely but firmly, insisting on fairness, and the officials often hesitated, unsure how to react to people who no longer trembled. Some officials became frustrated, trying to assert control through louder commands, but the townsfolk were prepared. They did not shout or strike back, but they did not back down. Their calm determination carried a power the oppressors had never anticipated. The marketplace became a symbol of the change. Merchants began to refuse unfair treatment, standing side by side with one another, supporting anyone who might face trouble. Customers saw the difference and found their own confidence growing. Children watched and learned. For the first time, the town felt alive again, buzzing not with fear but with quiet energy and a sense of possibility. Even the elders who had once hidden their voices behind years of caution began to speak openly. They shared stories of times when the town had been free, when people had spoken without fear, when music and laughter filled the streets. Their voices, once trembling, were now strong and steady, passing the lesson of courage to a new generation. They reminded everyone that silence had been a choice born of survival, but now survival could coexist with bravery. One day, a young man named Darren stood in the square once more. He had been among the first to resist quietly, but now he felt the weight of change in the air. Guards approached, expecting compliance, but Darren did not step aside. He looked them in the eye, calm yet firm, and spoke without hesitation. "This town will no longer live in fear. We will not bow for you." His voice echoed through the square. The crowd held their breath, waiting. The guards hesitated. They were trained to demand obedience, to rely on fear, but the people around Darren no longer trembled. Mothers, children, and elders stood silently, yet their presence reinforced the courage of those who dared to speak. The guards realized that fear could not control everyone anymore. Slowly, they stepped back, unsure what to do next. For the townsfolk, it was a moment of triumph. Not because they had defeated anyone in violence, but because they had reclaimed their own voices. The people began to act together in small groups. They repaired homes that had been damaged in the past, reopened shops that had been forced to close, and gathered to clean the streets. These acts were not only practical, they were symbolic. The town, once broken and fearful, was beginning to rebuild itself piece by piece, with its courage and unity leading the way. Even the children played differently now. They ran through the streets, their laughter returning after years of absence. They no longer hid at the sight of guards or strangers. Instead, they held their heads high, learning from the courage they had witnessed. The town's future, once uncertain and quiet, now seemed filled with possibility. The Deathworlders watched quietly, never taking credit. Their presence had been enough to awaken the dormant courage in the people, and now that courage no longer needed them. The townsfolk had learned that bravery was not about fearlessness. It was about choosing to act despite fear. One step, one word, one small act of defiance at a time could create change. Families gathered in homes and squares to talk openly. They shared their experiences and lessons, encouraging each other to continue standing firm. The bonds within the community grew stronger. Where once people had only whispered and avoided attention, now they collaborated, spoke freely, and supported one another. The sense of unity was stronger than the fear that had once ruled them. The guards, recognizing the change, tried to maintain control, but the town no longer responded as it had before. Fear no longer held the same power. The people had discovered their own strength, and that strength could not be taken from them. The balance had shifted, and the oppressors were learning that courage could move silently yet powerfully, without a single weapon. One evening, the elders gathered to speak to the townsfolk. They told stories of resilience and patience, but also of the power of action. "We have trembled for too long," one elder said, "but now we are learning that silence does not have to rule us. Courage exists in every step we take, and together, we can shape our future." The people listened, hearts swelling with determination. The transformation of the town was not immediate, but it was undeniable. Streets once hushed with fear now carried voices filled with cautious optimism. Children ran freely, merchants traded openly, and neighbors spoke to one another without hesitation. Even the landscape of the town seemed lighter, as if the sun shone brighter because the people were no longer living under the same shadow. Finally, the town understood that courage was contagious. It began with one Deathworlder taking a single step forward, and it continued as individuals found their own strength. The people realized that silence had protected them, but courage could free them. The trembling that had dominated their lives for so long was replaced by action, unity, and the quiet joy of reclaiming what had once been lost. The story of the Deathworlders would be remembered forever, not because they had conquered the oppressors, but because they had shown the town the path to their own courage, and the townsfolk, once silent and trembling, had learned the most important lesson of all. Bravery does not always roar. Sometimes it begins with a single step, a single voice, a single choice to stand. From that day forward, the town was no longer defined by fear. Its people had reclaimed their voices, their hearts, and their dignity. They had learned that courage grows in silence, but must eventually be acted upon. And as the sun rose over the marketplace, laughter, conversation, and hope filled the streets once again. The town had awakened, and nothing would ever make it tremble in silence the same way again.